The summer evening was still warm when Marcus Wilson grabbed his favorite basketball from his bedroom. The orange ball was slightly worn but perfectly broken in, just the way he liked it. At 14 years old, Marcus had already grown to be tall for his age, inheriting his father's athletic build and natural grace. "I'm heading to the community center, Mom," he called out, his voice echoing through their comfortable suburban home. "Be back by 9, sweetie," his mother replied from her home office. "And remember to keep your phone on." Marcus joined his best friends, Tyson and David, who were waiting outside. The three boys had been inseparable since elementary school, bonded by their love of basketball and comic books. Together, they walked the familiar route to the Henderson Community Center, the conversation filled with excited chatter about the upcoming school basketball tryouts. The community center's outdoor court was their favorite spot. The lights automatically came on at dusk, and although the official closing time was 8:00 p.m., the local kids often played until 9:00 with tacit approval from the regular security guard, Mr. Thompson. Tonight, however, Mr. Thompson wasn't on duty. The boys were deep into their game, the score tied at 18 all, when the harsh beam of a flashlight cut through the growing darkness. Officer James Barrett stepped onto the court, his hand resting intentionally on his holster. He was new to this beat, having transferred from another precinct, and he carried himself with an air of authority that bordered on intimidation. "What do you think you're doing here?" Officer Barrett's voice was sharp, cutting through the peaceful evening air. His flashlight beam focused specifically on Marcus, even though there were 5 other boys on the court. Marcus caught his basketball mid-dribble, holding it close to his chest. "We're just playing basketball, sir," he replied respectfully, the way his father had taught him to address law enforcement. Officer Barrett stepped closer, his boots making deliberate sounds against the concrete. "This facility is closed. Can't you read the signs?" He gestured toward the posting that clearly stated the 8:00 p.m. closing time, though it was only 8:15. "We usually stay until 9. Tyson tried to explain. "Mr. Thompson always—" "Did I ask you to speak?" Officer Barrett snapped, cutting him off. His attention returned to Marcus, who was still holding the basketball. "You seem to be the ringleader here. ID, now." Marcus's heart began to race, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm 14, sir. I don't have an ID yet, but I live just 3 blocks. "So you're trespassing, and you have no identification?" Officer Barrett moved closer, now just a few feet from Marcus. "Put the ball down and put your hands where I can see them." The other boys watched in stunned silence as their friend carefully placed the basketball on the ground and raised his hands to shoulder level. Officer Barrett circled Marcus slowly, his flashlight beam scanning the boy's Lakers jersey and basketball shorts as if looking for concealed weapons. "There's been vandalism reported in this area," Officer Barrett said, though no such reports have been filed. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" "No, sir," Marcus replied, his voice wavering slightly despite his best efforts to stay calm. He could feel sweat forming on his forehead, not from the game anymore, but from fear. "Empty your pockets," Officer Barrett commanded, the beam of his flashlight unwavering. With trembling hands, Marcus turned out his pockets, producing only his phone and house keys. Officer Barrett snatched the phone, examining it as if it might be stolen property. "How does a kid like you afford a phone like this?" he questioned, his tone heavy with implied accusation. "My parents gave it to me for my birthday," Marcus answered truthfully, fighting to keep his voice steady. He could feel his friend's worried stares and the growing humiliation burning in his chest. Officer Barrett held the phone just out of Marcus's reach. "I should run the serial number, make sure it's not reported stolen." "It's not stolen," Marcus protested, his voice finally cracking. "Please, sir, you can call my father. He's—" "Oh, now we're getting somewhere," Officer Barrett interrupted with a smirk. "Let me guess, your father's going to tell me who he is and that I'm making a big mistake." The other boys had backed away, unsure what to do. David had already pulled out his phone, texting their parents about what was happening. Marcus stood alone in the flashlight's beam, feeling smaller by the second despite his height. "All of you, go home," Officer Barrett ordered the group. "Except you," he pointed at Marcus. "We're going to have a longer chat about respecting property and law enforcement." What Officer Barrett didn't know, as he continued his unwarranted interrogation, was that this incident would soon become a turning point in his career. and not in the way he might have expected. By the time Marcus walked through his front door that evening, he was trying his best to hold back tears. His shoulders were slumped, and the basketball he usually carried with pride was tucked under his arm like a burden. The house was quiet except for the soft sound of jazz coming from his father's study, a nightly routine for Judge Robert Wilson as he reviewed his cases. Marcus tried to slip upstairs unnoticed, but his mother's voice called out from the kitchen, "You're 15 minutes late, young man." Sarah Wilson stepped into the hallway, ready to give her son the usual lecture about keeping time, but the words died on her lips when she saw his face. "Marcus, what happened?" "Nothing, Mom. I'm just tired," Marcus mumbled, but his voice cracked on the last word. Sarah had been a mother long enough to know when something was deeply wrong with her child. "Robert," she called out, "could you come here, please?" Judge Wilson appeared in the hallway moments later, reading glasses perched on his nose and a case file still in his hand. At 6'2", he cut an impressive figure even in his casual evening clothes. One look at his son's face, and the file was immediately set aside. "Son," he said softly, his deep voice carrying the weight of concern, "let's go sit down." In the living room, Marcus sank into the couch, his parents sitting on either side of him. The basketball rolled from his lap onto the floor, forgotten. For a few moments, no one spoke. Judge Wilson had learned through years on the bench that silence often brought out the truth better than questions. Finally, Marcus spoke, his words coming out in a rush. "There was this police officer at the court today. He wasn't like Mr. Thompson. He treated me like I was a criminal." Marcus's voice shook as he described everything that had happened, the accusations, the humiliation, the way Officer Barrett had singled him out. Sarah reached for her son's hand, squeezing it tight. Judge Wilson sat very still, his face a mask of calm that belied the anger building inside him. He had seen too many cases like this from the bench, but now it had reached his own son. "Did you get his name?" Judge Wilson asked quietly. "Barrett. Officer James Barrett," Marcus replied. "I saw it on his badge when he was checking my phone for the serial number." Sarah gasped softly. "He checked your phone? The one we gave you for your birthday?" Marcus nodded, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. "He said he needed to make sure it wasn't stolen. Dad, I did everything you taught me. I was respectful. I called him sir. I didn't argue, but he just wouldn't stop." Judge Wilson placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "You did exactly right, Marcus. I'm proud of you for handling it the way you did." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "What happened tonight wasn't right. It wasn't about anything you did or didn't do." "I know," Marcus whispered. "It was because of how I look." The room fell silent again. Sarah wiped away her own tears, and Judge Wilson took a deep breath, fighting to maintain his composure. This was a conversation they had hoped would come later, though they had always known it would come. "We're going to handle this," Judge Wilson said firmly. "Not because of who I am or what I do, but because it's the right thing to do. Officer Barrett needs to learn that his behavior has consequences." Marcus looked up at his father. "Are you going to call the police station?" "No," Judge Wilson replied, his voice steady. "We're going to do this the right way. I'm going to file a formal complaint with Internal Affairs. This isn't just about you, son. If Officer Barrett did this to you, he's probably done it to others who didn't have the means to fight back." Sarah squeezed her son's hand again. "Why don't you go up and take a shower? I'll make your favorite pasta for dinner." As Marcus headed upstairs, his steps a little lighter knowing his parents were in his corner, Judge Wilson went to his study. He sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and began typing. He knew the system from the inside, knew exactly how to document this incident in a way that couldn't be ignored or brushed aside. What Officer Barrett didn't realize was that his actions that evening hadn't just traumatized a teenage boy. They had set in motion a chain of events that would shake up the entire police department. The next morning, Judge Wilson sat in his office at the courthouse, his fingers drumming steadily on his mahogany desk. He had just finished filing the official complaint with Internal Affairs, making sure to stick to the facts without mentioning his position. The investigation needed to be fair and unbiased. Meanwhile, across town, Officer James Barrett was starting his shift at the police station, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. He sat in the morning briefing, sipping his black coffee and barely paying attention to the day's announcements. Barrett, Sergeant Miller called out as the meeting ended. A word in my office? Barrett followed his supervisor, still holding his coffee cup. The sergeant's office was small but neat, with various commendations hanging on the walls. Sergeant Miller closed the door and gestured for Barrett to sit down. We received a complaint about your conduct last night at the Henderson Community Center, Sergeant Miller said, getting straight to the point. Want to tell me what happened? Barrett shrugged, setting his coffee down. Just dealt with some kids trespassing after hours. One of them had an attitude, so I checked him out. Standard procedure. Standard procedure? Sergeant Miller raised an eyebrow. Since when is checking a kid's phone for serial numbers standard procedure for a simple trespassing warning? Before Barrett could answer, there was a knock at the door. 2 officers from Internal Affairs walked in. Detective Sarah Chen and Detective Marcus Rodriguez. Barrett's face paled slightly as he recognized them. Officer Barrett, Detective Chen said professionally, we need you to come with us to answer some questions. In the interview room, Barrett sat uncomfortably as Detective Chen reviewed his body camera footage from the previous night. His supervisor had already confirmed that no vandalism reports had been filed in that area, contradicting what Barrett had told Marcus. Officer Barrett, Detective Rodriguez began, can you explain why you singled out this particular teenager? He seemed to be the leader of the group, Barrett replied, shifting in his chair. I was just being thorough. Thorough? Detective Chen clicked through several more incidents on her tablet. Like last month when you thoroughly searched 3 black teenagers' backpacks outside the mall? Or the week before that when you were thorough in questioning a black college student about his car ownership? Barrett's face grew red. Those were all legitimate stops. While the investigation continued at the station, Judge Wilson was meeting with community leaders who had heard about the incident. Reverend James from the local church shared similar stories from other families. Mrs. Thompson from the Community Center Board talked about other teenagers who had stopped coming to play basketball in the evenings. This isn't just about my son anymore, Judge Wilson explained to them. It's about making sure every kid feels safe in their own neighborhood. Back at the station, Detective Rodriguez was reviewing Barrett's entire service record. A pattern was emerging, a pattern of targeting young black males for random checks and questioning. Each incident, taken alone, might have seemed minor, but together they painted a troubling picture. Officer Barrett, Detective Chen said, laying out the documentation, we have statements from multiple witnesses about last night's incident. We have your body camera footage. We have your previous records. Would you like to revise your statement about what happened? Barrett looked at the evidence in front of him, his confidence crumbling. I was just doing my job, he muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced anymore. Sergeant Miller stood in the observation room, watching through the one-way glass. He picked up his phone and dialed the police chief. Sir, we might have a bigger problem than we thought. This isn't just about last night. By the end of the day, Internal Affairs had interviewed 6 other teenagers who had similar encounters with Officer Barrett over the past 3 months. Each story was different, but the pattern was the same: unnecessary stops, excessive questioning, unfounded suspicions. Judge Wilson received a call from Internal Affairs updating him on the investigation's progress. He listened carefully, taking notes. When he hung up, he looked at the framed photo on his desk. Marcus at his last basketball game, smiling proudly. The judge picked up his pen and began writing again, this time drafting recommendations for department-wide policy changes. What had started as one incident was quickly becoming something much larger. Officer Barrett's actions hadn't just triggered an investigation. They had exposed a systemic problem that could no longer be ignored. The City Police Department's annual commendation ceremony was a grand affair, held in the spacious City Hall auditorium. Officer James Barrett sat in his pressed uniform among his fellow officers, feeling somewhat uneasy after the recent investigation but still confident in his position. The room was filled with police officers, city officials, and their families. Barrett wasn't up for any awards this year, but attendance was mandatory. He slouched slightly in his chair, halfway listening to the police chief's opening speech about community service and dedication to duty. His mind wandered to the Internal Affairs investigation, which seemed to be taking forever. And now, the police chief announced, I'm honored to introduce our keynote speaker for today's ceremony. He served our city with distinction for 15 years on the bench, and his work in community justice reform has been remarkable. Please welcome Judge Robert Wilson." Barrett's attention snapped back to the stage. He watched as a tall, distinguished black man in judicial robes walked to the podium. There was something familiar about the judge's face that made Barrett feel uncomfortable, but he couldn't quite place it. "Thank you, Chief Johnson," Judge Wilson began, his deep voice filling the auditorium. "Today, I want to talk about the sacred trust between law enforcement and the community they serve." As Judge Wilson spoke, Barrett noticed movement in the front row. A teenager in a neat suit was adjusting his tie while sitting between what appeared to be his parents. Barrett's heart nearly stopped. It was the boy from the basketball court, Marcus Wilson. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Barrett felt the blood drain from his face. His hands grew cold and clammy as he realized he had harassed and humiliated the son of one of the most respected judges in the city. The same judge who was now standing at the podium, talking about police accountability and community trust. "The badge you wear," Judge Wilson continued, his eyes scanning the audience, "is not just a symbol of authority. It's a symbol of responsibility. Every interaction with a citizen, especially our young people, has the power to either build or destroy trust." Barrett sank lower in his seat, remembering every harsh word he had spoken to Marcus that night. He watched as Marcus sat proudly next to his mother, paying close attention to his father's speech. The boy showed no sign of the fear and humiliation Barrett had seen on his face that night at the basketball court. The judge's words seemed to be aimed directly at him. When we abuse our authority, when we let our biases guide our actions, we don't just harm individuals, we harm the entire community's faith in justice. Officer Thompson, sitting next to Barrett, leaned over and whispered, "Isn't that the kid you had trouble with at the community center? Man, you really stepped in it this time." Barrett couldn't respond. His mouth was dry, and his collar felt too tight. He watched as Judge Wilson continued his speech, talking about recent incidents in the community without specifically mentioning his son's case. The judge was professional, never once looking in Barrett's direction, but the message was clear. In the audience, several other officers who had heard about the basketball court incident were now connecting the dots. Whispers spread through the rows as Barrett's face grew increasingly red with shame. After the speech, during the reception, Barrett stood alone near the refreshment table, avoiding eye contact with everyone. He watched from a distance as various officers and officials congratulated Judge Wilson. Marcus stood beside his father, receiving friendly greetings from senior police officials who clearly knew the family well. "Rough day, Barrett?" Sergeant Miller appeared beside him. "Now you understand why we take complaints seriously. Every person we interact with is somebody's child, somebody's family member." Barrett nodded silently, watching as Marcus laughed at something the police chief said. The teenager he had tried to intimidate was now comfortably chatting with the department's highest-ranking officials. The contrast between his assumptions that night and the reality couldn't have been more stark. As the reception continued, Barrett made his way toward the exit, his head spinning. He had treated a judge's son like a criminal based on nothing but prejudice, and now his career hung in the balance. But more than that, he was beginning to understand the real weight of his actions, not because of who Marcus's father was, but because of who Marcus was. A young person who deserved to be treated with respect, regardless of his family connections. The revelation wasn't just about Judge Wilson's identity. It was about Barrett's own prejudices coming back to haunt him in the most public and humbling way possible. The morning after the commendation ceremony, Officer Barrett's world turned upside down. He arrived at the station to find a notice on his desk requesting his immediate presence in the chief's office. As he walked through the hallway, he noticed how other officers avoided eye contact with him. Chief Johnson sat behind his desk, surrounded by several thick files. Next to him stood Captain Rivera from Internal Affairs. The chief's usually friendly face was stern and professional. "Officer Barrett, please sit down," Chief Johnson said, gesturing to the empty chair. "We've completed our investigation into your conduct, not just regarding the incident with Marcus Wilson, but your entire service record over the past year." Barrett's throat felt dry as he sat down. Captain Rivera opened one of the files and began reading. "In the past 12 months, you've conducted 167 random stops. Of these, 142 involved young black males between the ages of 13 and 25. None of these stops resulted in any arrests or evidence of criminal activity. I was just being thorough." Barrett tried to explain, but his voice sounded weak even to his own ears. Thorough? Chief Johnson leaned forward. Officer Barrett, we've received complaints from the community center, the local high school, and several businesses in your patrol area. Young people are afraid to walk in their own neighborhoods because of your thorough policing. Captain Rivera placed more documents on the desk. We've interviewed over 20 young people who had similar experiences with you. The pattern is clear, Officer Barrett. This isn't about one incident with a judge's son. This is about systematic harassment based on racial profiling. Effective immediately, Chief Johnson announced, you are placed on administrative leave pending a full departmental review. You will surrender your badge and weapon, and you are required to attend mandatory sensitivity training and counseling sessions. Barrett's hands trembled as he removed his badge. Everything he had worked for was crumbling around him. For how long? He managed to ask. The initial period is 60 days, Captain Rivera explained. After that, your return to duty will depend on your progress in the training program and the recommendations of your counselor. As Barrett left the office, he found Sergeant Miller waiting for him. I'll walk you out, his supervisor said quietly. As they walked through the station, Barrett could hear whispers and see fingers pointing in his direction. Meanwhile, across town, the local newspaper's headline read, Police Department launches major review of stop and question policies. The article detailed how a recent incident had led to a broader investigation of police practices, though it carefully avoided mentioning Marcus or Judge Wilson by name. At the community center, Mr. Thompson, the regular security guard, was talking to a group of teenagers who had returned to play basketball. Things are going to be different now, he assured them. The police department is making changes. Back at the station, Chief Johnson was meeting with his command staff. This isn't just about one officer, he explained. We need to review our entire approach to community policing. Judge Wilson has offered to help us develop new training programs. Barrett spent that afternoon cleaning out his locker. As he packed his things, he found a photo of himself at his police academy graduation, young and proud, believing he would make a difference. Now, 7 years later, he had to face the truth about how far he had strayed from those ideals. At home that evening, Barrett sat alone in his apartment, staring at his empty uniform. His phone kept buzzing with messages from fellow officers, but he ignored them. On his TV, the local news was discussing police reform and community relations. The reporter was interviewing teenagers from the neighborhood, including some he recognized from his patrols. I just want to feel safe walking home, one young girl said on screen. I shouldn't have to feel scared when I see a police car. Her words hit Barrett hard. For the first time, he truly began to understand the impact of his actions. It wasn't just about one night with Marcus Wilson. It was about dozens of young lives he had affected, trust he had broken, and fear he had created in his own community. The consequences of his actions were rippling out far beyond his own career, forcing not just him but the entire department to confront uncomfortable truths about how they served their community. And this was only the beginning of the changes to come. 2 weeks into his administrative leave, Officer Barrett sat uncomfortably in Dr. Sarah Martinez's office. The police department's counselor watched him with patient eyes as he fidgeted in the leather chair. This was his 6th session, and until now, he had barely spoken. James, Dr. Martinez said gently, using his first name, why don't we talk about your childhood? Tell me about growing up in Detroit. Barrett stared out the window for a long moment before speaking. My father was a cop too, he finally said. He worked in one of the toughest districts. Every night, he'd come home with stories about the crimes he'd stopped, the bad guys he'd caught. He paused, his voice growing quieter. Looking back now, all his stories seemed to have the same kind of suspect. Dr. Martinez nodded, letting him continue. Barrett had never talked about this before, not to anyone. I wanted to be just like him, Barrett admitted. When I joined the force, I thought I was doing what he taught me, looking for trouble before it happened. But now, his voice trailed off. Now what? Dr. Martinez prompted. Now I realize I wasn't looking for trouble. I was creating it. Barrett's eyes filled with tears that he quickly wiped away. Those kids at the basketball court, they weren't doing anything wrong. Marcus Wilson wasn't doing anything wrong. None of them were. The only thing wrong was how I saw them. In the afternoons, Barrett attended mandatory sensitivity training classes led by Dr. James Thompson, a black professor from the local university. Today's session focused on historical patterns of police bias and their modern-day impact. Officer Barrett, Dr. Thompson called on him. Can you share your thoughts on today's reading about implicit bias? Barrett straightened in his chair. 2 weeks ago, he would have dismissed the entire topic. But now, something had changed. I've been thinking about how we make split-second decisions on patrol, he said slowly. We tell ourselves it's about safety or experience, but maybe sometimes it's about fears we don't even know we have. After class, Barrett often walked through the city park, taking a different route than his old patrol. He started noticing things he'd never seen before. Fathers playing with their children, teenagers helping elderly neighbors with groceries, young men in hoodies who turned out to be college students heading to study groups. One evening, he passed the community center. The basketball court was full of kids playing, just like the night he'd confronted Marcus. He stopped to watch, staying in the shadows. Mr. Thompson, the security guard, noticed him but didn't say anything. They're just kids, Barrett whispered to himself, watching their carefree game. They're just kids having fun. The next day in his counseling session, Barrett brought up something that had been bothering him. I keep thinking about my own son, he said. Tommy was 10, living with Barrett's ex-wife in another state. What if someone treated him the way I treated those kids? What if another officer saw him as a threat instead of a child? Dr. Martinez leaned forward. That's empathy, James. It's the beginning of real change. During his sensitivity training that afternoon, Barrett volunteered to role-play a scenario, this time playing the part of a teenager being questioned by police. As another officer aggressively questioned him, Barrett felt his heart race, his palms sweat. For the first time, he physically experienced what it felt like to be on the other side. How did that feel? Dr. Thompson asked after the exercise. Terrifying, Barrett admitted, his voice shaking slightly. And I knew it was just pretend. These kids feel this fear for real. That evening, Barrett sat at his kitchen table, writing in the journal Dr. Martinez had asked him to keep. He wrote about his father, about his own prejudices, about Marcus Wilson, and all the other young people he had frightened. As he wrote, tears fell onto the paper, smudging the ink. His phone buzzed with a text from Chief Johnson. Your progress reports from Dr. Martinez and Dr. Thompson are encouraging. Keep up the good work. Barrett looked at his reflection in the window. The man looking back at him was different from the angry, biased officer who had harassed a young boy playing basketball. He wasn't fully transformed yet. He knew that would take more time and work. But for the first time since this all began, he felt something new: hope. The transformation wasn't just about saving his job anymore. It was about becoming the kind of person and the kind of officer he should have been all along. After 45 days of intensive counseling and training, Officer Barrett sat nervously in a small conference room at the police station. Chief Johnson had called him that morning with an unexpected request. Judge Wilson and Marcus wanted to meet with him. The room was set up for mediation, with Dr. Martinez present as a facilitator. Barrett's hands were shaking as he straightened his civilian clothes. He still wasn't allowed to wear his uniform. The door opened, and Judge Wilson walked in with Marcus. Barrett immediately stood up, his heart pounding. Please, sit down, Officer Barrett, Judge Wilson said calmly. His voice was neither angry nor accusatory. Marcus sat beside his father, looking taller and more confident than the last time Barrett had seen him at the commendation ceremony. Dr. Martinez spoke first. We're here today because both parties have expressed interest in having an honest conversation about what happened and how to move forward. Judge Wilson, would you like to start? The judge nodded and looked directly at Barrett. First, I want you to know that we're not here to punish you further. We're here because Marcus and I believe in the possibility of growth and change. Barrett swallowed hard, looking at Marcus. The teenager met his gaze steadily. This wasn't the frightened boy from the basketball court anymore. Marcus, Dr. Martinez said gently, would you like to share how that night affected you? Marcus sat up straighter. That night, you made me feel like I wasn't human, he began, his voice clear and strong. Like I was guilty of something just because of how I look. I played basketball at that court since I was 10. It was my safe place, but you turned it into somewhere I was afraid to go. Barrett felt tears forming in his eyes, but he forced himself to keep looking at Marcus. He owed the boy that much. The worst part wasn't the accusations, Marcus continued. It was knowing that if I made one wrong move, if I showed any normal teenage anger at being treated unfairly, things could have gone very badly. I had to be perfect just to stay safe. Judge Wilson placed a supportive hand on his son's shoulder as Marcus finished speaking. "Officer Barrett," the judge said, "would you like to respond?" Barrett took a deep breath. "Marcus, I've spent the last 6 weeks learning about myself, about my prejudices, and about the damage I caused. But nothing in my training hit me as hard as hearing your words just now." He wiped his eyes. "I am deeply, truly sorry for what I did to you." He continued, his voice shaking with emotion. "I didn't see you as a kid playing basketball. I didn't see you as someone's son. I saw you through the lens of my own bias, and that was terribly wrong." Marcus listened carefully, studying the officer's face. "Do you treat your own son this way?" he asked quietly. The question hit Barrett like a physical blow. "No," he admitted. "And that's part of what I've learned. Every kid I stopped, every teenager I harassed, they're all somebody's child. They all deserve the same respect and safety I want for my own son." Dr. Martinez watched the exchange carefully. "Marcus, how do you feel hearing Officer Barrett's apology?" Marcus thought for a moment. "I believe he means it," he said finally, "but actions matter more than words." "You're right," Barrett agreed quickly. "That's why I've asked the chief if I can help develop new training programs for officers, focusing on youth interactions. I want to use my experience to prevent other officers from making the same mistakes." Judge Wilson spoke up. "That's actually one reason we wanted to meet. The department is creating a new community outreach program, and we'd like both of you to be part of it, if you're willing." Barrett looked surprised. "Both of us?" Marcus nodded. "I've been thinking about starting a program where police officers and teenagers play basketball together. Not as cops and kids, but just as people. Would you be interested in helping with that?" Barrett felt a wave of emotion wash over him. This young man, whom he had treated so badly, was offering him a chance at redemption. "I would be honored," he managed to say. As the meeting concluded, Marcus stood and did something unexpected. He offered his hand to Barrett. The handshake was brief but significant. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was something equally important. It was a beginning. Walking out of the station that evening, Barrett realized that reconciliation wasn't about erasing the past. It was about creating a better future. 6 months after the basketball court incident, the Henderson Community Center was buzzing with activity. The sounds of bouncing basketballs, laughter, and friendly chatter filled the air. On the court, Officer James Barrett, back in uniform, was teaching a young boy proper shooting technique while Marcus Wilson coached another group nearby. "Remember to follow through," Barrett called out encouragingly. The boys shot ours perfectly and swished through the net. "That's it. Great job, Kevin." This was the third session of Hoops and Hope, the program Marcus had created with help from the police department and his father. Every Wednesday evening, police officers and teenagers came together to play basketball, share stories, and build understanding. Chief Johnson stood at the entrance, watching with satisfaction. Next to him, Judge Wilson smiled as he saw his son demonstrating a crossover dribble to a group of eager kids. "Your son has done something remarkable here," the chief said. "Who would have thought that one difficult incident could lead to all this?" The program had already made local news. A reporter from the city newspaper was taking photos as Officer Barrett and Marcus gathered everyone for a friendly game. Teams were mixed. Each had 2 officers and 3 teenagers playing together. "All right, Team Blue versus Team Red," Marcus announced. "Remember, it's not about winning, it's about playing together." Barrett looked around the court, remembering that night 6 months ago. The same space that had once been a scene of prejudice and fear was now filled with hope and connection. Some of the teenagers who had witnessed his confrontation with Marcus were now regular participants in the program. During a water break, Barrett sat next to Marcus on the bleachers. "I never thought I'd say this," Barrett admitted, "but you taught me more about being a good police officer than any training manual ever could." Marcus grinned. "And you've shown us that people can change when they really want to." The program's success had led to bigger changes in the police department. New training protocols, developed with input from Barrett and Judge Wilson, required all officers to spend time in community youth programs. The number of complaints about police harassment had dropped significantly. Other cities were taking notice. A delegation from a neighboring police department was visiting today, taking notes and talking to participants. They wanted to start similar programs in their communities. Officer Barrett called out Tyson, one of the teens who had been with Marcus that first night. "Can you show me that defensive stance again?" Barrett jogged over to help, remembering how he had once seen these same young people as threats instead of the bright, talented kids they were. Now he knew their names, their dreams, their fears, and their potential. Later that evening, as everyone was packing up to leave, a new kid walked into the gym. He looked nervous, watching the officers with obvious fear. Marcus noticed him first and walked over. "Hey there," Marcus said warmly. "I'm Marcus. Want to join us next week?" The boy hesitated. "Are you sure it's okay, with the police here and all?" Barrett overheard and approached slowly, keeping a respectful distance. "I used to be the kind of officer who made kids afraid," he said honestly. "But Marcus here helped me learn a better way. We'd love to have you join us." The boy looked between them, surprised by Barrett's honesty. "Really?" "Really," Marcus confirmed. "This is a safe space. We're all just people here." As the boy signed up for next week's session, Judge Wilson watched from the doorway. He turned to Chief Johnson and said, "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments." The chief nodded. "Your son turned a negative experience into something that's changing our entire department. These officers are better at their jobs because they know the kids in their community as people, not statistics." Later that night, Barrett sat in his car, watching as the last few kids left with their parents. He took out his phone and called his own son Tommy. "Hey buddy," he said when Tommy answered. "Remember how I told you about the basketball program? Well, I was thinking maybe you could come visit next month and join us for a few games." As he drove home, Barrett passed the spot where he used to park his patrol car, looking for trouble. Now he saw the neighborhood differently, not as a place to police, but as a community to protect and serve. The change that had started with one frightened boy and one biased officer had grown into something that was transforming an entire city, one basketball game at a time.